And this time I ended up working with a 12-step program, a 12-step sponsor. That was how I got sober. But I also was really involved in the treatment center in terms of they had a program there called the Mind, Body, Spirit program, which is pretty cool. I mean, it was something I wasn't into previously. But at that point, there was a guy that ran that part of the program who was also in recovery. He had about 10 years sober at that time, which was incredible to me because even a week sober was like, a bit long time. And so he was teaching things like yoga, meditation, spirituality, and it just started to open up my mind to those practices and that kind of way of living.
Welcome to the Inside Addiction podcast. Today we have Dylan on the podcast. Welcome to the podcast, Dylan.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So in terms of getting us started, I wondered if you could just start by telling us a bit about your background and your own personal history and story with addiction.
Yeah, of course. So I'm in recovery from drug and alcohol addiction for about, just over 19 years now. And that's been a part of my story is addiction and now recovery. And I got involved in the recovery industry, working in the recovery field when I got sober. So I've had a lot of experiences over that time working in different places and working with different populations and using different tools. And now my hope is to share some of those with a broader audience and to, help other people along this path as well. So there's more to it, but that's kind of the general overview. And I'm sure that we'll talk, in more detail as this podcast goes on today. But that's generally who I am, what I'm doing here, and why I'm here.
Perfect. And in terms for you, Dylan, tell us a bit about when drugs and alcohol first came into your life. Where were you? What was going on?
So I actually grew up not wanting to pick up alcohol or drugs because I had seen what they did to some of my friends and my family. So on my dad's side, there was a history of alcoholism, and my grandfather was an alcoholic, and my uncle had some challenges with addiction. And so in hindsight, I didn't think I would pick up alcohol because I just had this idea that it would be bad, like nothing good would come of it. And when it came to drugs, some of my friends that got involved in drugs, their personality would change and then become like a different person. And so that didn't really appeal to me. The problem was that I didn't have a way to deal with some of the issues that were coming up. So I started to feel depressed in high school. I started to have suicidal ideation. I was pretty insecure, just generally socially insecure, but especially when it came to relationships with women. And so a lot of these issues that I was having, I didn't have coping mechanisms to deal with them. And when I got to college, I didn't drink or drug at all in high school. Like I said, I actually didn't think I ever would. But when I got to college, I found people like me that were athletes and got good grades, and they were partying. So I'm like, oh, okay, I guess it's not bad, right? I guess it doesn't have to be bad for everybody. And so I drank for the first time. And when I drank for the first time, I felt something that I maybe had never felt, which was okay in my own skin. All those issues that I was having, the insecurity, the depression, the suicidal ideation, for a period of time, alcohol helped quiet those thoughts and helped make me feel okay. So to me, it was almost like a miracle, because I was already doing a lot of things that looked like successful on the outside. So I was a scholar athlete. I was getting all A's. I was captain of the wrestling team. I was, all these things, and I was miserable, So when I drank, it seemed to fix that. But as we know with addiction or alcoholism, it's like I need more to get the same effects. So I started drinking more, partying more. Eventually, those same feelings came back. It wasn't working anymore. So now I was depressed, but I was also drinking a lot. And now I'm dealing with consequences from that. So now I'm not showing up to class as much at college. I'm not getting good grades. I'm still getting by, but it's not the same level that I was at before. So what ended up happening was I ended up dropping out of college to pursue acting. And in that process of pursuing acting and moving back home, some things happened, some traumatic things happened. One in particular, I got assaulted by a gang. And in that process, it affected me obviously in different ways. But one of those ways it affected me was I got this mentality of like, screw this, I'm just going to do drugs. Because up to that point, I drank, but I still was under the mindset of I'm just never going to do drugs. And at that point, I just, screw it, I'm going to do drugs. And I started to do all types of drugs. And it spiraled from there. So doing more drugs, now I'm getting arrested. Now I'm more depressed because of where my life is going. And I just want to drown out the kind of circumstances of my life with more drugs. And it was this downward spiral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like you say, it was a downward spiral. And like you say, it just kind of compounded. Like you say, you felt
Totally.
the emotions from the trauma, and then you drank to soothe those, but then that created more emotions and more negative feelings and more depressed. And like you say, then kind of, dropping out of college and going down that path. And one thing that
Exactly.
stands out is a lot of people and clients say to me, and I've said it to myself, and I'm sure you said it to yourself, is like, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to do drugs. I'm not going to
Right,
drink
right,
alcohol. I'm not
right, right.
going to get there.
Yeah,
I won't be
yeah,
that
yeah.
bad. That's for the
Right,
other people. That's for the druggies who do drugs. I don't do drugs. I'm all
right,
good. I
right.
don't drink that
Yeah,
much. And
yeah,
we always
totally.
think that, right? That we won't be there. We won't do that. I mean, what was it like for you to kind of pass those boundaries and those kind of, that sense of identity? I'm not going to drink, then you drink. I'm not going to do drugs, then you do drugs. Like, how was it to kind of pass those kind of checkpoints?
It was interesting because a lot of this is in hindsight. At the time, I wasn't really aware. I was kind of aware of what I was doing, but I wasn't that aware. So when these things were happening, it was just kind of, it seemed gradual, at the time, but it really wasn't. I mean, I went from being a scholar athlete in high school to being homeless and using crack and getting arrested all the time within a couple of years, in the same town where I grew up. So it was pretty fast. But when I go past these points, it was just kind of like a natural progression for me of where I was at. So when I ended up drinking for the first time, and it was a natural progression to drink more. And when that didn't work, it was a natural progression to move on to something else. And then the first time I got arrested, there would be moments, I guess, when I think about it now, there were moments where I realized, had epiphanies that my life was going in a really bad way and that I might need help. For example, the first time I got arrested was a big one. That being said, that eventually became normal. So I didn't get help at that point. I
Yeah.
didn't get help. I just drowned that out with more drugs,
Yeah. And I think, like you said, it becomes normal, right? We normalize the behavior, like getting arrested.
Yeah.
Oh, that just became a regular occurrence, right? That just became normal. Whereas
Yeah.
before, when you weren't even drinking, you're like getting arrested. That's like a massive thing, right? And then the behavior gets normalized, the
Yeah.
consequences get bigger, and we just keep
Yeah.
going down and down and down the spiral and down that rabbit hole. And I mean, did
Totally.
you have any particular rock bottom moment or moments that really made you turn things around to get help?
So the what originally I got help two different times, I would say, and the second time is when I ended up getting and staying sober. The first time I got help, I went to rehab because the court said either you go to jail or you go to rehab. So it was kind of an easy choice. Even though I didn't really want to get sober at that point, I did go to rehab and I did get sober for a short period of time, just given that circumstance that I had to be at this rehab. And when I did get sober that time, it did give me a little space from the substances and gave me a little clarity in terms of where my life had gone and what was possible. So the idea that I actually could be sober, and I could heal started to come into my awareness, because up to that point, even though it was just a few years of this progression, by those end of those few years, I really thought that my life was over and I probably would die from addiction. At I was 25 at that time, and I really believed that my life wasn't going to last much longer. Um, that being said, I didn't really believe I was struggled with addiction. I still had this idea that I could maybe drink here and there or smoke weed here and there. I didn't think I needed to be abstinent. And so I tried the experiment to see if I could, manage drinking or manage drugs. And it went, like most of us that struggle with addiction, and the experiment went horribly wrong, And so I ended up in weeks, I ended up back in full blown addiction, and now I got arrested again, and so that's when I went back to rehab, and that's when I stayed sober. And I had a lot of consequences up to that point, but for some reason, the loss of freedom is what really shifted things for me. I was in a tremendous amount of emotional pain. I had overdosed. I had attempted suicide. I mean, there were so many things that you would think would motivate me to seek help and change. And yet it was really the loss of freedom going back to jail, that the county jail, not the town jail, that really did something in my psyche. It was like, okay, I really need to get help, and that's when I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's interesting what you said about moderation versus abstinence. Some people say, can I not just learn to moderate? Can I not just kind of have a
Right,
few
right, right.
drinks? Can I not just drink
Yeah,
at weddings and birthdays? I promise I'll behave and I won't get things out of hand. Can I not
yeah.
moderate? And like you say, or can I not just smoke some weed? I'm not doing crack or drinking or any of that stuff. Can I just smoke a few joints? And a lot of people try and moderate or find like a lesser substance to move on to. I mean, what's your perspective on that? Do you think people can moderate, or do you think they should be abstinent and be like, I'm not doing anything?
I think it's an individual choice and an individual journey, because it depends on the person. I mean, if you're struggling with addiction, the essence of addiction is that the substance, what's put into the body, creates a craving that no amount of willpower will stop, really. And so I'll just continue to seek out that substance and use that substance regardless of consequence, whether that consequence is jail, whether that consequence is overdose. So, I mean, for somebody that struggles with addiction in that way, it's the only way I know of is abstinence. That being said, there's some people out there that they might suffer some consequences, but they can still manage to get by, and maybe they're drinking a little too much, or they don't feel good about the weight they're gaining, or a hangover they have, but they still show up to work, they still show up to their relationships. So and then in that case, maybe they can moderate. It's not the greatest thing for them possibly, but it's not life or death necessarily.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. I agree.
Mm.
And when it comes to that situation when you're in jail and that was your sort of rock bottom, when you would like look, or the moment you decided to change, like I said, there was many rock bottoms and things that people would say, surely you woke up then, Dylan, and you were like, nope, I still wanted more, still wanted to bang my head against the wall a few more times. But then you
Mm-hmm.
got to the point when you were in jail, and what happened then? What changed? Where did you go?
So I went back to the treatment center, the rehab center that I had been through the first time. And this time I ended up working with a 12-step program, a 12-step sponsor. That was how I got sober. But I also was really involved in the treatment center in terms of, they had a program there called the Mind, Body, Spirit program, which is pretty cool. I mean, it was something I wasn't into previously, but at that point, there was a guy that ran that part of the program who was also in recovery. He had about 10 years sober at that time, which was incredible to me, because even a week sober was like, a bit long time. And so he was teaching things like yoga, meditation, spirituality, and it just started to open up my mind to those practices and that kind of way of living. And it really started to help. I started to get these moments of feeling okay again, and feeling like there's possibilities in my life again, and feeling connected. It wasn't, all good right away, but it was progressively starting to experience some of these good feelings again. And meanwhile, I'm working with the 12-step sponsor and going to meetings, and then also working with this guy doing things like yoga and meditation. So the combination of those two is what really started to shift my life around, mainly to shift my mind around and to free me of that obsession to use, and free me of some of those deeper emotions that were driving me to want to escape myself so much.
Yeah. And were there any particular emotions that really stood out to you that when you sort of dug into your own psyche that were there?
Yeah, so depression was a big one. Depression, shame, shame of where my life had gotten to. Those two were probably, there was some anger there. I mean, just looking back over some of the things that I had done or that had been done to me, there was some like resentment and anger there. But I would say depression and shame, just kind of like this almost nihilistic attitude that my life was over, that I wasn't, that I was worthless. I mean, these deep feelings of insecurity, you know.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
And like I say, rehab, the 12 steps, yoga, having that structure in place really helped you. And
yeah, yeah.
with the 12 steps, give us a bit of an understanding of what the 12 steps are for those who don't know what the 12 steps are, or AA. Just tell us a little bit about that and how it helped you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest parts about it that was helpful was getting into a community of people who were on the same path and who had walked the same journey. So that, they were heading in the direction I wanted to head in, and they had been where I was at. So that was for me, the 12-step community. That was what it was. It was people that knew what I was going through because they had been there and they knew how to get out of it and were out of it. Were out of it for a while. And by out of it, I mean sober, and they were living life again. They weren't caught in the active cycle of addiction. And how I connected with that community was showing up to the meetings. So like AA, there's a ton of different 12-step fellowships, AA, NA, there's so many different ones. But the key was finding, for me, like finding one that connected to the struggle I was having, whether it's alcohol or drugs. And then showing up to those meetings, getting what's called a sponsor. A sponsor is somebody who helps you work the program of AA. So the meetings and the program are two different things. You go to meetings and you can share about what's going on with you. You can hear other people share about what's going on with them. And then there are the 12 steps. And 12 steps are the program of originally AA. Now, a lot of different programs use the 12 steps. They're the same exact 12 steps. It's just specific to that addiction. So, for example, step one, admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives have become unmanageable, right? But if you're going to, Overeaters Anonymous, it's like admitted we were powerless over compulsive overeating and that our lives were unmanageable. So all the other steps are the same. That's the only one that's different depending on which group you go to. But a sponsor is somebody who guides you through the 12 steps and helps you work those 12 steps. The purpose of the 12 steps is to get you free of the obsession to engage in the addictive behavior or substance and to reconnect you to what they call a higher power. So it's not necessarily a religious God, but it's a power that's greater than what we've had so far, which hasn't worked, right? So if we're going into a 12-step meeting, chances are we're at a place where we're defeated. Addiction has defeated us, and we probably tried a lot of things maybe on our own to stop using, to moderate, and it just hasn't worked. So that's why we seek out help. And in the 12-step philosophy, we seek out help through other people, but also ultimately through a spiritual connection.
Yeah. And you mentioned working the steps. What does working the steps mean?
So a sponsor will determine what exactly it means. So for me, the way that showed up was we went through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and went through it because it outlines in that book. And once again, there are different books for different 12-step fellowships, and each one has their own kind of way of working the 12 steps. But we went through the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and worked the steps that way. So,
Yeah.
for example, it's going through some of the steps, which are more of I wouldn't say just intellectual, but they're more of an emotional action, and some are very, very much physical actions. So, for example, step one, admitted we were powerless over alcohol and our lives were unmanageable. That's not something I necessarily have to do, like physically do. It's more of a mental thing. Like, is my life really unmanageable? Am I powerless? Reconciling that question with myself. But when you move on through the rest of the steps, some of them are more action based. So I write down in a 4-step, I write down things like we were just talking about, the deeper emotions that I was struggling with. Well, I would write down some of these things, the fears that I have, the resentments that I have, like the stuff that's been probably driving a lot of this desire to escape reality. And so I write those down and I share them with my sponsor. and we kind of take a look at patterns and deeper causes and conditions for what's been driving me. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense.
Cool.
Perfect sense. And
Yeah.
do you personally have like a favorite step or a step that was really resonated with you, or that you feel like is a good one out of the 12?
I mean, they all kind of go together, but for me, it's like, especially when I think back to what it was like being in active addiction and even in early recovery, which was not easy. The one that I just keep coming back to is that step one, because that's really what it all rests on, is if I believe that I can't do this alone, then I'm going to seek out support and help. And as I do that, things tend to get better. But if I start to think that I'm doing it alone or that I can handle it all by myself, that's where I tend to get into trouble.
Yeah, and I think with step one, right, is oftentimes a barrier. People can't, sort of let go or realize that they need to let go of that sense of control, the self will, and they find it hard to surrender, and that kind of keeps them
Totally.
stuck. So it's like really, I guess, nice if you like to see someone get over that and to really do a step one to get past that, because you're like, okay, now they're kind of understanding it, they're moving forward. Whereas I feel
Totally.
like that's like a barrier to overcome.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah, yeah. And for you, I want to ask what your higher power is, but a lot of people may find it hard to connect with spirituality or God, or if they hear the word God. I mean, what's your higher power, and how do you feel like that plays into your recovery?
So it evolves. I mean, I've explored religion, I've explored different spiritual paths. It's still something that is evolving. There are, for me, Christianity has been part of my path. That being said, I wouldn't consider myself a fully Bible following Christian, in terms of like solely viewing the world through that lens and only that way, which some people do. That's just not my experience. So there have been different iterations of it, and it's constantly evolving. I'm constantly growing, in terms of what a higher power is to me and how that shows up in my life, how I connect to it, and yeah, what that looks like.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one way I always kind of sat with that question of a higher power is, for me, when I was in kind of active addiction, for me, my higher power was like the version of me that wasn't in that madness, that knew better, that knew that he shouldn't behave like that, who had control, had
Mm,
strong mental health. In some ways, the version I am closer to now, I'm not going to say I'm that version now, but I aspire to be that version, and to grow and move forward. And definitely from where I was like 6 years ago, definitely I'm close to that person now. So at that time,
awesome.
my higher power is like the me of now in some ways. It has some of those characteristics of taking care of his mental health, having good self-care, looking ahead at the future, looking after myself, taking my recovery seriously and going to therapy and doing
Awesome.
all those things that I value. And to me, that was the higher power, because for me, it's like I couldn't see that version as the addict Luke that was stuck in all that madness. I couldn't
Yeah,
see
yeah.
that. I didn't necessarily believe it. I had to have faith that version of me existed, and that I could somehow get to that version, that he was somewhere there in some future universe in the future.
Mm.
So to me, that's how I always kind of sat with that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you bring up a good point about, like, being disconnected from that potential that we have in ourselves, or for that potential that we kind of feel is possible, bringing that connection back, bring that higher self, I think, as you put it, reconnecting with that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And for you, Dylan, you were in the treatment center, you were working on recovery, going through the steps, doing yoga, getting into that world. What kind of happened for them? How did things progress over the next kind of few months?
So the as I worked the steps, things started to improve in my life around me. And I had some pretty cool experiences in doing that. So yes, we move on through the steps. The eighth step is making a list of harms that I've caused, and then ninth step is trying to making amends, basically setting those harms right to the best of my ability. So as I was doing these steps, things would start to happen. I'd start to feel better. The obsession to use started to go away, and then cool things would happen externally in my life. Like one of the amends was how to make amends for a friend of mine that had passed away, and also I had been stealing money for, I would go around and pretend like I was raising money for cancer research, and I would use it to get high. And so one of the things is, how do I make amends for that? And the even sadder part of that was that my friend had died from cancer, you know. So I was looking at these things, which weren't easy to admit or look at, but it was essential for me to get sober to do so. But as I would do that, things would start to happen that kind of validated that I was on the right path. And so as I did these amends, I was also working on a vision board, similar to what you were talking about with a higher self, like looking at the possibilities of my life. And this guy in the treatment center that I mentioned earlier on in our talk today, who was mentoring me, he had me do a vision board and like, what would your life look like in recovery? So I was doing the amends, trying to set right some of the harms I caused, and then doing this vision board. And at the very same time that all this was happening, I got this thing in the mail at the treatment center. There's really no reason why I should have received this in the mail. I mean, it's like, wasn't my address, but for some reason they sent me this at the rehab. And it was from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which raises money for cancer research. Now on this vision board, one of the things that I put down was go to Disney World and run a marathon. And like, I just put stuff down. Even though I didn't really believe it was possible, I was acting as if I did. And I was running at that time a little bit. Marathon's 26 miles. I was running maybe 6 miles. So it's a big difference, but I just put down marathon because it was like the ultimate thing for runners. So I got this thing in the mail at the rehab from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. And one of the things that they do is they raise money for cancer research. And one of the places that they do it is Disney World. And one of the ways that they do it is through events like marathons. And so it was just one of these moments, just serendipitous moments, where I looked at the vision board and I looked at the amends that I was trying to make. And it was like, it just all lined up. I was like, wow, I think this is meant to be. I'm meant to raise money for cancer research by running a marathon in Disney World, And so I did. And it was about a year after I was locked up in jail in Connecticut that I was traveling down to Florida with Team Connecticut to run a marathon. And I had my friend Damien, is his name. I had his name on the back of my jersey and honoring him. And it was like things like that started to happen more. And it was just very cool, man, just to start to walk this path and see for the first time in a while, like being connected to life again and see that unfold.
Yeah, that's amazing. And like we may say, what a higher power moment, right? To have all of those
Totally
dots kind of connect, and such an amazing way to make amends, really, like to see all of those things happen and to really reflect on some of the things you've done in the past and to make amends for that and to go and run for this charity. And like that was part of your vision and moving in the right direction. And obviously exercise is awesome as well, and the health benefits and having a goal and all those things. That's just really amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was cool for sure.
Yeah. And in terms of having a vision, how important would you say a vision is in one's recovery?
I mean, for me, it's a co-creation. So it's something that I have intentions, I have desires. At the same time, it's important for me to let go of the outcome, or to practice letting go of the outcome. Because when I get into trying to force something to happen, it's just not, it usually doesn't happen when I'm trying to force something, and it's just not good for my mental health. So there's a balance there. And I think it's important to have some ideas and some desires and some goals. I also think it's important to not have such a strict hold on them. So I think there's a balance there personally.
Yeah, to kind of have the goal and have the vision, but like you say, not be attached to the outcome. Yeah, exactly.
Right,
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I know that's played a role for you in your recovery and in the work you do is community. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that. What role did community play for you in your own recovery?
Yeah, that's a great question. As I looked back over my experiences, especially as I got into doing more speaking and podcasts, and was trying to figure out what are the common elements of my journey that I can really pass on to other people. And the one that was the most obvious was that this power of community was evident throughout my whole journey, regardless if it was recovering from getting sober, recovering from drugs and alcohol, or just other stuff that would come up during the process of recovery. Because as I've stayed sober, there have been life challenges, there have been deeper issues that have come up, now that I wasn't drowning out with drugs and alcohol. So when I looked back, it was like every time that I was struggling with something, or every time that I had this amazing experience of feeling connected to a higher purpose or deeply connected to other people, it was in these immersive community experiences. So 12 steps is a very immersive community experience. You're going to meetings, you're sharing your life story, you're being very vulnerable about, some of the deepest thoughts and feelings you have. And ideally, you're doing it consistently at the same meeting. So you're doing it with the same people over a long period of time. So you're growing, you're getting to see them grow. There's commitments that you can take. So it's not just like you're on the outside looking in. So maybe you go there to set up for the meeting. Maybe you make coffee. Maybe you chair the meeting. Like there are different ways to become really involved. And so as I would do these things, I started to feel really connected, and stayed sober. And then moving on to living at a yoga center. And I mentioned becoming a yoga teacher, and I got this opportunity to live at a yoga center. And I lived there in a volunteer program for 2.5 years. It was amazing. And that also was an immersive community experience. And it was different. It wasn't about getting sober, but it was about growing spiritually. It was about living a holistic lifestyle, practicing things like yoga and meditation, and having fun. I mean, we do things like I'm into spoken word or slam poetry. So we had poetry slams there, which are like a poetry competition kind of. And so in those experiences, it was just like the community would come together and we'd have this common shared experience that was really amazing. And so as I looked back over my path, it was like there's a certain power when people come together with a shared vision and a shared intention, and they're willing to show up for each other to support that intention or support that vision. Like amazing things can happen. And so that was a big one. When I look back, it's like the power of community was very much at the core of a lot of these changes in my life.
Yeah, that's amazing. And one thing in terms of communities, like you said, with the 12 steps is an amazing community to go there and, go to meetings and realize that you're in the same boat as someone else, right? Because addiction can be very isolating. And one thing you said that really reminded me is like having commitments, right? When I first started going to meetings, I had commitments, and within the first couple of months, I got the keys to the church, and I would open it up and I would go in there and I'd set up the room and put up the signs, and I made sure that I took on a commitment because I wanted that accountability. I wanted the keys to be like, look, if Luke doesn't show up, no one's showing up. I can't just cancel the meeting for like these 10, 20 people. Like I've got to be there. And that just really forced me to be there and be in that environment and to keep going, because I needed to open it and look after it. And,
Awesome.
having those commitments are really, really important, right? So that external accountability can really help us stay on track.
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. And like I said, then you went to the yoga and lived in the yoga center, which was really, really awesome. And, you mentioned having a shared vision and having a shared intention. I mean, is there anything else that really makes a good community? What would you say makes a good community?
Well, some of the places also that's in the community settings that were the most impactful were the ones where there was a space for authentic expression. So in a 12-step meeting, that's pretty much exactly what it is. The purpose of a 12-step meeting is to talk about people's experiences with the steps and how they work the steps, but also it's a place to share the challenges that we're having in that process of trying to live sober. So it's a place really for deep, authentic self-expression. And in the yoga center, especially when we did slam poetry or spoken word, it was like people were encouraged to come up with something that was their own. So, a 3-minute poem, that it doesn't have to be a poem like in a traditional sense of rhyming. It's just really a 3-minute experience of self-expression, authentic self-expression. And in that setting, when people are seen and heard in their full self-expression, like healing and bonding can happen in a deep way, on a deep level. So in all these places, it was like that was another common element. You know, it was like this space for authentic self-expression. When it was done in community, could have a really profound impact.
I 100% agree. Having that connection and also a sense of like vulnerability. When I heard you speaking, I was like,
Exactly. Yeah.
that sounds a bit
Yeah.
vulnerable. And the vulnerability
Yep.
can lead to connection, right? Which is the opposite of what we
Totally.
have in addiction, which is disconnection. So having that
Totally.
vulnerability and connection. But some people may be thinking, fuck, that's really scary. Like connecting with all
Right.
those
Right. Right.
people when I'm in
Yeah.
addiction, what's happening? What if they see me? What if I'm seeing what's going on? I mean, what advice would you give to someone who's still in the madness, thinking, don't know if I want to walk in that door? You know, I spoke to someone recently and they said, you know, I was outside the meeting and I just didn't know if I wanted to go in. Like I didn't know, I was just sitting in the car,
Mm.
wasn't quite sure. It was my first meeting. Wasn't sure if I wanted to go. What do you say to someone in that situation?
Well, first, I'd say that I could relate, that I've had those thoughts too, and a lot of people do. In fact, that's one of the first epiphanies that I think I had when I heard people share at meetings, because they would share things like exactly what you're talking about right now. They might share, you know, when I first got to meetings, I didn't want to be here, I was afraid to go inside. And I'd hear people share these things. They're like, oh, okay, so I'm not the only one, you know. That being said, to get over that hump, it took some willingness to face fear, to move through discomfort, you know. It didn't take a lot, but it did take some. And for me, that willingness came from necessity. It's like I needed to take a leap of faith in order to get better, you know. Even though my mind was pretty loud about all the reasons why I couldn't take the leap of faith, why I couldn't go to the meeting, why I shouldn't go to the meeting, you know, et cetera. There's an acronym for fear. It's false evidence appearing real. You know, so the stories that my mind comes up with, you know, oftentimes are not based in reality. You know, it's like, what's the worst that can happen if I go to a meeting? It's like, probably nothing, you know, it's like, but my mind comes up with all these reasons about why I can't do it, why it's going to be too uncomfortable, why I'll be judged, why I won't fit in. Just it's incessant. You know, most of it's not based in reality, but I only know that because I took the leap of faith and got to experience that. I can't necessarily, I've got to take the action and then the feeling will follow, not the other way around. You know,
Yeah,
not wait for myself to feel good and do it. It's like usually it's the other way around. I got to take the action first.
yeah, to kind of lean in to the experience,
Right.
right? And
Right.
bracket off those thoughts, put those thoughts to one side and be like I said, I'm going to go to the meeting. So I'm going, just kind of walking through the door because the benefits can be amazing, like you spoke about in those communities, whether that's the yoga or the 12 steps or the meetings, you know, that sense
Totally.
of connection and having those people around you is really, really important to be on the same page and to really feel connected.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah. And in terms of managing some of those thoughts, you know, oftentimes we hear a lot about kind of meditation or mindfulness, and a lot of people don't really understand what that is or how to start. Or they may say, you know, Dylan, my mind's so fucking busy. How am I meant to
Mm.
meditate? It just goes bonkers. I wonder if you could talk a bit about meditation and what meditation is to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of what we were just talking about in terms of, you know, I could relate to the mind being all over the place. So it's something that, you know, people tend to think of meditation as they're doing it wrong if their mind is really loud or their thoughts are really scattered. And I would say that they're not doing it wrong, that that's actually just the way that the mind is. And so the practice of meditation for me is trying to settle into myself regardless of how crazy my mind feels or how loud my mind is. So it's not stopping thinking, you know, and I don't know if I know anybody who can really stop their thoughts. I might have moments of peace where my mind is really quiet, but that's not necessarily the goal of meditation for me. It's really nice and it's great when it happens. But the goal for me is simply to try to practice being present in the moment. And for me, it's very simple in the sense of like the best meditation that I've found, and I've done many different types, is the classic focusing on the breath. There really is no, you know, there's a lot of variations, and it's nice to do different ones. And I do like using different breathing techniques, different meditations, but truly the basics are like where it's at. So for me, sitting down, closing my eyes, beginning to breathe deeply, and just focusing on one part of my breath. So that might be focusing on my belly rising and falling, focusing on the air coming in and out of my nose. I also will incorporate maybe a phrase or a word. I might incorporate inhaling God, exhaling stress, and just coming back, inhale God, exhale stress, and doing that over and over. So there are different variations, but once again, just simply sitting, breathing, and trying to, the image I like to use is if my mind was a river, then I'm sitting by the river watching the water go by. So I'm trying to create some space from my mind, not necessarily stop my mind, but just step back and be able to witness it rather than being dragged away by the river with my thoughts, my feelings, sensations, etc.
Yeah, perfect. Like I say, witness it. You are not
Yeah.
your thoughts, having that distance from your thinking, because especially in addiction, it can be like, right, I get a craving, I want to go and do coke, for example, whatever it may be, and you just laser focus on that, and your brain just won't shut up, and it's like, I have to drink, I have
Right,
to drink,
right,
I have to
right,
drink, I have to do a line, I have
right.
to do a line. And meditation, like I say, when you have that distance and that separation, really allows you to take a step back from those thoughts, whether that's, I don't want to go in the meeting, I don't want to go in the meeting, I don't want to go in the meeting. Like you say, that meditation really helps have that distance and really bracket those thoughts off so you can take the right actions you need to.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And I mean, for you, Dylan, in terms of the here and now, how do you typically spend your time and your days? What sort of things do you get up to in the here and now?
So I have, my days are pretty structured. A lot of that started with early recovery, getting up, making my bed, praying, meditating. Like a lot of these things that I still do almost 20 years later started in the first few weeks of recovery. So I still have a morning routine where I get up, pray, meditate, make my bed, this type of stuff. And same at night. So at night, it's like I'll pray, I'll do maybe a reading or something like that. But inside of that, I love to run. I've been getting back into running lately. I connect with other sponsees. So I, sponsor people in 12-step fellowships. I have a pretty good job now. I, show up for family, try to show up for friends. Yeah, it's a good life. I used to think that a good life would be if I had $1 million and I had the nice car, and it's like I just want inner peace today and be able to be present and content. It's to me that's like a good life.
Yeah. And you've been in recovery a while. How long did you say? Was it 18, 19 years or something you said?
Yep. Yeah, a little
Yeah.
over 19 years. Yep.
Yeah. Congratulations, firstly.
Thank
That's
you, man.
amazing.
Thank you.
That's amazing. What have been a lot of people struggle with like long-term recovery and relapsing and some of the things that may throw us off. I mean, how have you managed to go 19 years? What's the secret?
So a lot of it is routine, consistency. Go to meetings regularly, and it's not perfect. So there have been times when I've not done that, then I get back into it. But overall, it's kind of like the trajectory is always positive. So I've consistently gone to meetings pretty much for the past 19 years. And when I don't, it becomes obvious that I need to, so I get back to them. That's a big one. It's just the consistency and the practices that I did early on, like continuing those. Prayer, meditation are just as important, if not more important than meetings for me. They're pretty close. And then taking care of my mental, physical health. So meditation is a big one that helps those, exercise. I mean, the typical stuff that's not necessarily easy for somebody who struggles with addiction, because oftentimes in recovery, other addictions will take hold. So for me, started using sugar pretty heavily, like really heavily, to the point I was obese, having physical issues as a result of it. And that was in recovery from drugs and alcohol, because I still wanted that experience of kind of being out of myself. It wasn't just like having a cookie. I was having like massive amounts of sugar every single day. And so taking a look at just the basics, health, exercise, sleep, diet, those types of things over the long run can help a lot with the recovery process.
Yeah, and maintaining it, and like I say, keeping up and being consistent with all of the things that kind of got you clean, continuing to do those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No,
And the
awesome.
last thing
Awesome.
I'll say, I'd like to mention one more thing is continuing to kind of take out the trash, so to speak. So I mentioned, early on through the 12-step process, talking about some of the things that I was holding on to, these fears, these resentments, and so it's like continuing to talk about that stuff if it comes up. And the new stuff is, I mean, we're humans, so we're going to get angry, we're going to get fearful, but not staying alone with those types of things. And sometimes what will happen, this is my experience, is a period of sobriety will unearth things that I didn't even know were there. So years of addiction might push things down, trauma, things like that I'm not even aware of. But after being sober for a period of time, those things can start to come up. And so it's really important to take a look at those and deal with those. And I know you mentioned somewhere in this interview today the therapy, and that's one that I've found really helpful too. I do see a therapist, and that's been very important for me as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And is there any particular things that have come up that you really feel like have been like traumas that have surfaced, or things that may have kind of derailed you or been challenging over the past 19 years? What are some of the things that have tested your sort of commitment, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, trauma is a big one. So some traumas I'm aware of. Getting jumped by a gang was traumatic. That was one that I was aware of, and some I'm not. So I've dealt with, in recovery, I've dealt with pretty severe anxiety and depression. Um, and so taking a look at that, because there was no real reason why I should be feeling that way, in terms of there's nothing in my life at the moment that would be causing this. You know, I'm doing meetings, I'm working with a sponsor, I'm exercising, I'm eating healthy, I'm meditating, I'm praying, and so there's no real reason why I should feel so incredibly afraid or so depressed, even to the point of suicidal ideation in recovery, years into recovery. And so when I started to explore what that could be, it became clear that it's deeper emotions, deeper issues, probably related to trauma, that were driving that. There's very, very uncomfortable sensations in my body that my mind was trying to make sense out of, and were just spinning off into anxiety and depression because it couldn't make sense out of what was going on in my body, because there's nothing in the present that would make sense. It was old feelings, old memories that were really stored in my body that might not ever have a visual representation. So I may never visually remember, like I remember going for a run yesterday and I can see it. Well, I may never visually remember some of these traumas or some of these things like I would remember the run yesterday, but my body remembers, in the sense my body has these sensations. My body has these very uncomfortable sensations that are memories that I need to process. And so I found ways to process those. Yoga helped, anything that kind of gets me out of my head and into my body. But somatic based therapy was really key. So the type of therapy that could get into my body and learn how to process some of these body-based, most likely traumatic memories.
Yeah. And what happens in the kind of somatic therapy and like somatic experiencing? What kind of happens in those kind of sessions? How does that work?
So it depends on the method. I mean, I did a really good one called Fear Memory Integration by a guy named Jim Polero. He's a naturopath, and he wrote a book by the same name. And he happened to live in this area where I live, and so I was blessed to work with him for years, and it was really, really helpful. And so in those sessions, the premise was that a lot of neuroses were driven by unconscious trauma, and it was the mind trying to make sense, like I was just talking about, trying to make sense out of something in the present moment that had nothing to do with the present moment. It was something that happened in the past that was continuing to repeat itself in the body, a response, a fear-driven response that was just constantly getting triggered. That's like the essence of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so we'd go into a session with whatever the mind was freaking out about. So for me at the time that I was doing work with him, I was struggling with anxiety in the form of OCD. So I would obsess about At the time, I was a personal trainer working at the treatment center, and I was developing a fitness program for the rehab. And I would develop these documents, like a workout routine or whatever. And I would obsess about if I got the document right, like if I wrote a word right. And I couldn't stop obsessing about it. Like so much so that if it was like a weekend night, like a Saturday night at like 10 o'clock, I would drive to my job, open up the fitness center, check the sheet to make sure I spelled the word right, drive back home, halfway back home, turn around, drive back, check it again. It was just like I was driven by this energy. And it was very uncomfortable because on one hand, it was similar to addiction. On one hand, I knew I shouldn't be doing, like I knew it was kind of crazy, but I felt compelled to give into this mental obsession. So in these sessions, somatic therapy sessions, we'd go in and we'd start to talk about the mental obsession, but then we'd go into what does it feel like when you're having the mental obsession? Well, I feel tightness in my chest. I feel sick to my stomach. Okay, well, let's stay with that for a little bit. And so I bring my awareness from focusing on the obsession to focusing on the sensations in my body. And when I did that long enough for my mind to kind of quiet down, inevitably other memories, other feelings, other thoughts would start to come up as I stayed with my body. And as other thoughts started to come up, this therapist, Jim Polero, he would asked me to voice what else was coming up. And if he heard something or saw something he thought might be meaningful, he asked me to stay with it in terms of just stay with the feeling that's coming up or talk about it a little more. And these sessions aren't like typical therapy where it's half hour. It was about 2 hours a session, which was perfect because it took about an hour for my mind to quiet down, for me to really get connected to my body. And that's when stuff would really start to come up that was meaningful. And when I would stay with something long enough, inevitably some deep emotion would come up and get released. And when that would happen, the OCD would lessen and I would feel a deeper healing. So, this was like over a decade ago now, and I still struggle with anxiety and depression at times. That being said, it's not as bad as it was. And I attribute that to that work because in that work, a few specific memories that I could remember, the most traumatic memories don't have a visual counterpart because the more traumatic something is, the more likely the mind is to dissociate or block it out. That being said, there were some memories that I could remember that I had suppressed. So in this therapy, those memories came up and I was able to express the emotion that I wanted to. Towards these people, towards these situations. And that's really what was driving the OCD was I had all this energy locked in me, anger, sadness, tears that was just locked in there that was fueling these kind of neurotic thought patterns. But once I was able to release those thought patterns and express that energy, the desire to give into these thought patterns lessened and my mind was quieter. That makes sense?
Yeah, perfect sense.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And it's really interesting. It's really interesting how it works and how the importance of not just managing the mental thoughts or the cognitive thoughts, but also the body and the bodily sensations and what happens in the body. I think it's really important to make that connection and to work through it, like you say.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. And as we come towards the end, where can people find out more about you? Where do you want them to go to contact you and interact with you? Let them know.
So Dylan Lundgren is my name, and they can search me on any social media platform. So, or even LinkedIn. I work with a really good company in the addiction treatment industry, and so that they can also connect with me through that on LinkedIn. And I have a YouTube channel where we like to share, create motivational videos, encouraging videos for people in recovery. That is Recover You. So Recover YOU, like Recover You. And so YouTube is also a good place to find what we're doing, what we're creating, or they can just look me up by my own name on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn.
Perfect. And we'll leave all the links to all of Dylan's stuff on his YouTube channel down below in the description, so you can go and have a look at
Perfect.
that
Thank you.
and on the website. Anything, Dylan, you want to leave the audience with as we come towards the end?
I would say for anybody that's struggling, just take the first step. You don't have to, take the whole journey right now. Just take the next step.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me here.